bom. Mulailah pengoboman. Bom seluruh kota. Dan seluruh orang yang ada di dalamnya.
Hello, and welcome to our Last of Us HBO Spoilercast, where each week we'll be reacting to the latest episode and talking in depth about what we've watched. I'm Phil, or AK Black and Red, and on this channel I talk about The Last of Us a lot, along with other survival and horror themed games. So if that's your thing, be sure to subscribe. Joining me this week, we have Abby, the official Atreus cosplayer for Sony Santa Monica and God of War Ragnarok, and also Ellie in the Spores Productions fan film The Last of Us All We Lost. And is it right to say you're you one of the executives or people who run Spores Productions?
Yeah, I'm one of 3 producers, so we sort of make all the projects and plan it all.
Producers, I couldn't think of the proper word in my head, so
it's all good.
And we also have Will, who runs Resident Evil Central, the largest Resident Evil and horror game account on Twitter, now at 40,000 followers, and my co-host for the Horror Game of the Year Awards. So you can find links in the description for everyone on the panel, so be sure to check them out and show them some support and some love. As the name implies, spoilers lie ahead for the second episode of the HBO series, as well as the first episode, I suppose, but I forgot to update my script. So if you haven't watched it yet, then I highly recommend you do before proceeding. If at any point we are going to spoil anything from the games, which we shouldn't do in general, but we will give a warning ahead of time. So if you've not played the games and you've only watched the show, it is safe to carry on watching. Just make sure you've watched the first 2 episodes at least. With all of that out of the way, let's dive into the thing that we're here for. So first, we're going to start off with our overall impressions of this week's episode and how we felt about it, our general reviews, anything that we want to pick out of it, and our general verdict. Abby, do you want to kick things off?
Yeah, geez. I was really, really excited to see more of the infected. Like, that's what I was really looking forward to this episode, knowing that we were going to see our first look at the clickers and a little bit more of, just how the infected work. And I think that's my biggest, one of my biggest takeaways is just how much they've defined how the infection works and how the Cordyceps communicates. Like, it just adds so much, many more high stakes to the rest of the game, knowing that one small, issue somewhere could completely trigger a whole bunch of infected, the other side of town. It's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. And I was saying, as someone that's played the games, a lot, I didn't realize until the episode ended that I was holding my breath for the whole thing. It was so tense.
Yep. I mean, that's a long time to hold your breath. I know it was shorter than last week's episode, but even so, that's still impressive. So, yeah, overall, good then.
So good. Yeah, definitely. Obviously, some of the changes felt quite intense. I think everyone knows what I'm talking about. But it just added so much more. I feel like there's a lot more high stakes when it comes to the infected and the Cordyceps now. It's not just, masks on. It's like if you disturb the Cordyceps, there is an actual threat now, not just whichever infected are in the room with you.
Yeah.
So yeah overall excellent. Chef's kiss.
I mean, we'll talk about that a lot more once we get into kind of the deep dive and going through the episode. But I think just to mention, I was listening to the official podcast, and Neil Druckmann said when that Craig Mazin came up with that concept, and when he did, Neil said basically, that would work great in gameplay if I thought that. So I don't know how I feel about having to play that sort of thing. I think that might be too high stakes. But yeah, that would be interesting to see. So what about you, Will? What's your kind of takeaways, overall verdict?
Overall, I think it was it was a fantastic episode. The way they continue with their attention to detail from the games and then expanding upon that and changing it so it fits within the TV format. It's just fantastic to watch. And as a huge fan of the game, it's just fantastic to see a different point of view and a different actors taking up on the role. But overall, yeah, no, the whole tenseness of the episode was fantastic. You were just waiting for the runners and the clickers, because that's all I've been waiting for. Is get that first experience. That's what I said at the end of the last episode, was what I was looking forward to the most, and they fed me pretty well. So yeah, no, overall, yeah, amazing.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of my big takeaway from it, because we got a glimpse of it at the start of the first episode, and then pretty much all of the 20 years later didn't really involve any infected at all in the first episode. So I think they've kind of kept us on tenterhooks waiting to see how it'd be delivered and what we'd do. We saw the glimpse of the runners in the initial outbreak, and then that was kind of it for then. So making us wait and delivering those clickers, for me, that was kind of that moment of just I'm really enjoying how they're leading into like the horror of it all, and particularly making it feel a lot more tense, because it's obviously tense and horrific when you're playing the game, but I think you probably wouldn't feel as tense about it if, like, TV Joel, who's obviously a real person, and like you can see in flesh and blood, if he was doing what we do in the games, where you sort of go, right, there's 5 clickers in this room, let's sneak around and shiv each one of them, and it's all fine, we don't need to worry about it. Whereas that moment, and then messing up with the sound and like the clicker getting too close, all of that sort of stuff was just absolutely superbly done, and the makeup and everything, the way it looked.
Yeah, the special effects were incredible. I think that's one of my as someone, obviously a cosplayer and someone that works a lot with makeup, like the fact that they're using, for most of it, actual practical effects is awesome. Having the clickers in full prosthetic pieces, it just adds so much. And you can tell that with the actors as well. Like they fully feel like they're in that scene, in that moment. But yeah, the prosthetic design and the sound design in this episode was so cool. Like there was the bit where obviously Tess goes off and Joel and Ellie are just sat together, and like the building's creaking around them, but it sounds like clickers. Like there's just like clicks that keep coming, and I was like, oh, they're coming now. And it was really cool that like I didn't know when the infected would actually pop up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, we'll talk about other scenes as well. We're going to kind of focus on the clickers, because I think obviously that was the highlight. That was the big thing of the episode, and that was kind of, from me, in terms of the thing that I'll remember when we go back to, well, the two things that I remember. The other one is the kind of kiss at the end, which I have thoughts on, which we will get to, because mixed feelings about that. I think everything else in the episode was done superbly, and I think I'll get into that later. But yeah, that was sort of one thing where I was a bit dubious on some fronts. But yeah, that was, I think the other thing that we talked about being infected, the other thing I in terms of my opinion on it, was the performances in that were absolutely stellar, and particularly you got a lot of lines delivered from the games and all this sort of stuff, and seeing people like comparing them, but it was the things that weren't there, like the extra little details in terms of Tess's characterization and the relationship with Joel's reaction to her being infected, and the flinch and all that sort of stuff. So I think there's a huge amount there that they did to like give extra depth to those characters, which I absolutely love. So that was another thing. So just so that my verdict isn't just clickers.
I know.
But yeah, with that, let's dive into, I think, talking about the episode in more depth. So we left off last week. Joel and Tess agreed to smuggle Ellie for the Fireflies in exchange for a car battery, because they want to reach Joel's brother Tommy, only for an encounter with the Federal Guard to reveal that Ellie's been bitten and is apparently immune. So when we pick up this week, this is Neil Druckmann's live-action directorial debut, and it's also the first time he's directed something that he didn't write, because Craig Mazin wrote the episode, and he had a cameo as an infected as well, which I didn't catch at the time. So I think it's his live-action acting debut as well. But before we get to any of that, we open again, once more, we open with this cold open, which is before the outbreak. We don't see any action. It's mostly dialogue. There's an autopsy scene in the middle of it, but there's like the mycologist who gets picked up in Jakarta in Indonesia by the military, and then gets told that there's this infection, and she checks on it, and then comes back, and her verdict is just, what do we do about this? Is bomb the city and everyone in it.
Yeah.
So get your thoughts on this opening scene and the idea. I don't know whether it would be every single episode running forward, but this idea of opening with this sort of more
World
clinical view of things and just doomsaying, I suppose.
I just feel like that was something almost a little bit missing from the original games. Of like, I really wanted, when the universe expanded with like comics and stuff, I was like, I really wanted more world building of how the infection took over, because obviously the first game, as soon as the infection starts, that's like boom, that's it. But I really wanted to know how it came about, so getting to see that in the show I think is really cool, and they do it so well, and I really hope they carry on that at the start of every episode we get a snippet of the past and like how it came to be.
No, yeah, it was just all about how she said so much with so little words that she said, and the whole thing with scientists is that in the face of this horror, usually in other things in life, like scientists will always have that, we'll always find a way to fix something, but the way she just says no, bomb, just like, it just adds to that whole danger factor of the infection and how dangerous all these infected are. So I think, I think that's adding that from the gate, it's just fantastic.
It was really reminiscent of, I don't know if you guys have seen Chernobyl, but obviously Craig wrote, I think he was the writer, wasn't he, for Chernobyl? But it really felt reminiscent of that, and just how it shows that raw emotion of, we've lost, like, this is it, we can't do anything. And it's not this big panic, it's just, that's it, what can you do?
Yeah. I think as well, it's interesting because obviously when we get to now, and Ellie and the whole fact she's immune, and there's kind of this element of hope in there, which I think comes a lot into like kind of Joel and Tessa'S interactions as well. But before that, everything is like this basically creeping despair. We start like last time John Hannah's signed, it was just like, no, there is nothing, we lose. There's no way out of this. And then this woman in Indonesia is in the same sort of situation. There's no alternative but to bomb. And it is kind of, the vaccine for these kind of things is a common trope across a lot of this sort of fiction. But like, even in Resident Evil, they had vaccines for all these horrible viruses that they put out. There was always something there, whereas in last, it's just, no, we'll lose, we're screwed, sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, Cordyceps is just a living thing, isn't it? It's not just like a virus or whatever it is. And that's what I really like about how they're sort of expanding on the Cordyceps and making it is like a threat in itself. It's not just, oh, I'm infected, like, oh, I'm part of something now, like a bigger network.
Yeah.
Ooh, horrible.
I mean, well, after all that doom and gloom, though, we do get a little bit of light relief, because we get, like, when the next scene where Joel and Tess interrogate Ellie, like, we have this sort of opening scene where she's on the grass and like bathed in light and wakes up, and then Joel and Tess are there with the assault rifle pointed at her, and then all the kind of banter that happens in that scene, because there's a lot of serious stuff to get through, and there's a lot of like I mentioned before, the interplay between Joel and Tess in particular, and you can see Joel's resignation. He's kind of like, I don't believe any of this. This kid's going to die, and I'd rather send her back to the city so I don't have to shoot her, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas Tess is starting to believe this. Tess is already starting to kind of go, well, she made it through the night. She survived. There's some sort of hope there. So that's kind of one element of it. And then we also get to see Ellie being this kid who's got this attitude on her and everything else, in terms of how she interacts. She doesn't like Joel, and when she asks for a gun, and they said, "Oh well, fine, I'll just throw my sandwich at them."
Okay.
But you don't really see that playfulness from characters in that kind of situation. Like in a huge outbreak, you wouldn't think there would be much humour inside, but still they find this human side of that interaction out in the wilderness. It's No, I really like it. The way they bounce off each other, you can see that relationship developing.
Mm. I find it quite cool comparing Bella's Ellie to obviously in-game Ellie, because I feel like Bella's Ellie is almost a little bit more evil's not the right word, but I feel like Bella's Ellie is a lot more distrusting and a lot more I don't know the word for it, but I feel like she's a lot more closed off than game Ellie. And I think that's going to be really interesting in the future to see how she opens up with Joel. I feel like we're going to get more spats between the two of them, because she seems to be really like on edge around him at the moment. But those little glimpses of opening up and trusting him, like when she's watching him like beat the heck out of that guy in the first episode.
Yeah, we can kind of, I think there's more room to do that as well, because they've got like this TV format, and I think obviously you were talking about that earlier, Will, as well, and that obviously there's not that continuous run of gameplay, and like this part of the story in the game is told essentially through one kind of cutscene moment, and then we're running away from more military and through until the point where we've got to climb through the buildings full of clickers. So there's not really that moment that they have there where they rest overnight and the sun rises and they're ready to go in that sense, and that kind of, there's a lot more space for like those realistic interactions, because obviously if Ellie was more distrusted and that was happening while you're trying to like, you know, crouch walk through a bunch of soldiers, it doesn't work in the same way. And I think that's probably one of the things where we're going to hopefully see a lot more of that. We do see through this episode, but I think in future episodes as well, where that space that games don't have, because they don't need to put gameplay in, because you know we're just watching, gives them more space to kind of have interactions that wouldn't really work in that situation.
Sure.
But that kind of, I think, as well brings us on to the point where they go from that interrogation and that initial point. Also to mention as well, speaking of that, like a bit more realism with Joel's kind of hairline fracture on his hand after punching the guard, and you can see is like that shaking it. You see that sort of thing, which feels really powerful, because you kind of forget like the amount of, after you've beaten however many 100 NPCs to death, you kind of forget that punching someone till they die would take an awful lot of power and energy, when you would break your hand multiple times. So after that, we then kind of have this moments where they're walking through Boston, and they kind of like, they've got to get to the capital, and we see the buildings, like the two skyscrapers which are put over together, which obviously we see in the game, and the whole set building looks fantastic. I'm sure the taller parts were CG, but obviously that main bit was all sort of built practical on the set, so they're walking through that real kind of wreckage there, which is where we get a bit more mention of calling back to the cold open. So they're going to bomb, you know, that's what they did everywhere. We get the thing, and that was their way of controlling the infected. And we also get our first mention of not just the clickers, but also the bloaters, if you caught it, where Ellie is asking about the rumors, that like the stories that people tell about the outside, and she's like, so there aren't infected who'll throw spores at you and like use that, and that's obviously a reference to bloaters. But that's also, I don't know what you thought about that. Like the reaction to it seems to imply that a bloater is not something that Joel or Tess have encountered, so it'll be very much a surprise as far as that goes.
Yeah, a lovely surprise.
So lovely. I really when they announced that obviously spores weren't the main spread of infection, I was like, they can't get rid of that completely. There's no way. So I feel like it's going to be like an infected that's been alive for like 15, 20 years. At that point is when they just start spreading through spores. So I feel like we're going to get spores at some point, and it's going to be a lot higher stakes than it was before, because maybe they don't have masks.
Yeah, that's the thought. I'd never thought, because if they're not carrying gas masks around, and then that becomes an issue, then there's a lot more of a persistent threat to it. So this is kind of the point before we get to the hotel, like as they're traveling through, and they're also debating of which way round to take to get to where they need to be. Are there any other kind of things in this part of it that stood out to you, used that, or anything particular that you think was worth falling back to?
I really, again, it was our first glimpse of like the infected as like a pack, wasn't it? When they're all like, I got physical shivers when they were all like just rolling on the floor together, and just this, because if you watch like closely, they like move in waves, and it just again cements that thing that they're all this one huge unit. And like watching them just watch it from afar and realizing that that's what they're up against, and Ellie obviously seeing that for the first time, it was like, oh, that's really creepy.
Yeah. No, just even imagining coming across that amount in a game is frightening enough. Never mind in a more realistic setting. It's yeah,
Horrifying.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that point, because I remember looking at it and thinking, are they on the floor? What are they doing? Just kind of seeing it there, and then you kind of don't see that again for a little while, because the next time we see any more, like we see the spores, like not the spores, the tendrils, and they're like dead when they get round to the museum. Before we see, obviously later on, it comes to that epic climax. But yeah, I mean that idea of like, if you step on one of these tendrils and you can alert them like a mile away, that's something that's far more horrific, I think, than any zombie horde that you may have ever seen in other things. Certainly.
Yeah.
It's surprising how many people have survived, to be honest, with this new take on it.
Yeah.
Like, I'd be dead so quick.
Yeah, it's just like one wrong move, you just step. Oops. Oh well, guess I'll die.
Well, it makes more sense, doesn't it, why people stay away from the cities so much? Because, you know, in the games, obviously, you come across like a pack of infected, you get rid of them, then that area is clear. But knowing that you have repercussions that span over like a massive range is, terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. So after that, then we could come from like sort of that, we go into slight deviation again. I mean, it's still in Boston, but it's just a scene that's from somewhere else, which kind of took me by surprise a little bit, because we go into a hotel which is waterlogged, which is something that we don't see till we go into Pittsburgh in the games. As far as it doesn't change the plot of it, because it's just a place to pass through, but we get a few more details there. And I mean, before we get into like what actually happened there, I don't know what you thought, but I thought like when they had that kind of discordant piano music, and then tying that to like there being a piano there and like the frogs sitting on it, and it's bums like pressing the keys.
God, Piano Frog is my favourite character so far of the series.
Yeah.
Well, fun fact on that as well that I saw was that they originally were going to have a bird on there and have it eat a fake frog, and then it didn't, which is why the frog became the star of the show.
Do you think they just found this random frog?
Yeah, he must have just been like outside the set. He'd set up his piano, just playing away, and then they go,
That'll do.
We'll have a role for you.
We'll make you a star.
I need to check the credits. I want to see if the frog's in the credits.
If not, a grave injustice, no doubt. But again, we get more playfulness there. We got a lot more sort of because like that starts off like the notes. It's all like set up this creepy atmosphere, and then it kind of that's undercut to a degree because they go into the water, and Ellie mentions that she can't swim, and then Joel just kind of jumps down and shows how shallow it is in a kind of this kind of mocking way, which I thought was quite fun. Now, obviously, there's a question of whether at any point we'll see him make a jump on a pallet to get across anywhere.
Feel like, yeah, we will. We've got to, or a cool
Yeah.
back to it at least.
Yeah, well, I mean, they've called back to a lot of stuff. So, because I mean, shortly after this and after the rest of the scene there, then Joel boosts Tess up in that very much gameplay like scenario. So, we do have a lot of that sort of stuff. And then, but before we get to that, we have Ellie kind of playing out the checking into the hotel and that sort of thing, which again you see in the scene if you play it in Pittsburgh. And it's obviously Bella Ramsey delivers lines slightly differently. Like there's a different syntax in terms of where she pauses and how she delivers it and that sort of stuff. But there's very much the spirit of Ellie and that kind of playfulness there, and you see a lot of that stuff in there. And like Joel's reaction when they go like, "You're a weird kid," and the fact that she just shoots back, "You're a weird kid." I think just kind of made that add a lot extra on top. So was it mainly just the frog that stood out from that scene before we were, or was there anything else?
Yeah, no, the frog was cool, but just that whole bit, it's nice to see at that point. Yeah, Bella's Ellie starting to open up more, and because it's easy to forget, like she is a kid, like as much as she's been through, she is a kid.
Yeah, 14 years old. It's like I can't even remember what I was like. That seems like a distant memory to me at this point. But yeah, it's always a kind of weird thing because there's a tendency in a lot of this sort of stuff, which I think the game did it really well as the show. But kids either always get act older than they are or act too young, whereas this seems to strike the right balance. Again, from my limited long ago knowledge of being a 14-year-old. But yeah, that kind of brings us on into the hotel proper, and we have this moment where Tess goes off and we've got kind of the interaction between Joel and Ellie, and she starts asking questions, and that's where he kind of closes up, and you see
Yes.
yeah. So yeah, I'm just kind of going through in sequence, but I don't know if because now that I'm kind of going through this episode, like it was obviously shorter than the last episode, but I'm also realizing a lot more of it was just kind of they walked to this place and they walked it, and it was just like a sequence of like passing through areas until we get to that big scene in the museum. But I mean, there's a lot delivered in there, and there's a lot of stuff, but it's a weird take on the like that is probably the most reflective of a video game. I don't know if you've thought the same as just that sort of sequential move through place to place and find an obstacle, traverse the obstacle, move through next place with kind of light smatterings of dialogue in between, rather than I suppose what the usual thing would be, like have camp out, big moments of exposition, big action scene with loads of monsters, next exposition scene, next action scene. But even though it's more video gaming, that says again, correct me if it's just me, but it feels like it flows more. It feels like they're packing an awful lot into this, even though when you describe it, it goes like, "Oh, that's actually quite short sequences."
Yeah.
No,
I think because we haven't got the time to develop those relationships, like in the game, you've got so much time to build it up because we've got the shorter runtime. They've got to build those relationships up quickly. For obviously the new people that haven't seen or played the game. But yeah, no, they feel I was going to say they're a lot less video gaming, a lot more human. Because they the characters in the game come off very can't think of the word. Yeah, no, I think just, as I said before, it's just a lot more human. Just seeing their interactions and how they are, and how we're getting that extra side. Like we think that they're these unstoppable bullet machines, but they're not. They're they suffer with so many different things, what they've seen throughout the time they've been out there.
Mm. And the way they like keep stuff from each other as well. Obviously, earlier in the episode when Tess asks Ellie, oh, what were you doing like in the QZ zone on your own? Or like asked, like, was Ellie on her own, obviously, when she got bitten? And Ellie's like, yeah. And, as fans of the games and having seen the trailers and stuff, we know that the Left Behind DLC is going to be a part of it. And we're going to see Riley. It's interesting that we get a little bit more depth into each character and knowing that they have backstory and knowing that they have stuff they're hiding from each other when we as viewers sort of know. Cool.
Yeah. And yeah, I'd forgot about that sequence of dialogue, or I didn't pick up on it earlier. But yeah, when she says that about I was no one alone. But there's also that moment as well, isn't there? When is anyone going to come looking for you? Like parents, family, boyfriend? Like,
yeah,
no.
no. It's cool. But yeah, I mentioned earlier that bit, obviously, when Tess goes off and it's Joel and Ellie sat together, that the sound design in that bit's really cool because I kept thinking there was going to be a clicker pop out because the way that the building was creaking just really sounded like that. And I was like, oh, I was really tense. And I was like, oh, they're not listening out. They're not listening out for like danger. And, having watched the episode, knowing that Tess gets bitten later on, I was like, oh, this must be where, Tess is getting bitten secretly off in another place. But obviously it wasn't. There was no threat. But as a viewer, I felt like there was.
Yeah. And that's possibly one of the things as well. Like, we've got a lot of these scenes where there's like this little moment of tension and then they move on quite quickly, or we think that everything's going a bit weird and then it's just a frog playing the piano and all this other stuff. And then there's the little banter. It's now that I think about it more and drawing on what you just said there, it does feel like building up to the scene that we finally got. They've kind of been drawing this out and kind of giving us moments of tension, then sort of go, oh no, actually it's fine. It's all just the character development. I'm kind of trying to build in a false sense of security to get us to the point where we see something a bit tense and then think, oh well, maybe it'll be fine. Maybe there's not too much to worry about. Which is obviously the same trap that Tess falls into when they kind of, after they get through and they decide they have to go through the museum and see the guy who's been like mauled to death and go, maybe he died outside and crawled inside, and like maybe not. But yeah, I think just trying to think if there's anything kind of in between those 2 points that we need to pick up before we get to the big one, then obviously where everything else kicks off. I don't think so. I think that probably takes us from like once Tess comes back, they go, and then they were pretty much inside the museum at that point.
Yeah.
Afterwards. So before we talk about the clickers, I mean, can you just mention as well that the set design and how that museum looks compared to like again, this is I think the level of practical effects they've used to like build up worlds that feel real, but also feel like something that you're like, yeah, this is The Last of Us. I've played through that area. I know where that is. That level of attention to detail is something absolutely fantastic. But yeah, we get to the museum, go up the stairs, and this was probably one of like before. This is where we get the build up before we get the actual moment where everything explodes and there's like that click. We've got the everything seems dead, but the stairs are creaking. We've got to be silent and like this sort of thing. And was this the point where like you really started holding your breath?
Yeah, for sure. It was obviously seeing like when they're walking up the stairs and there's just like the piles of bodies and cordyceps that have just become one. Obviously Ellie steps on like a hand and it's just like you realize that that's not just overgrowth, like that was people, and it's like, oh, they could come alive at any moment. And yeah, that was when it was like, okay, they're going into dangerous territory. And it's really clever, like talking again about obviously adapting a video game into a TV series, that they use the whole bright areas are safe, and then as soon as it starts transitioning to a dark area, you're like, okay, well, this is going to be trouble.
And then once we get into the doorway, and then is it a pillar that collapses? I think, or something collapses and makes a big racket.
The door frame or something.
Yeah. And that's when obviously the clicking starts, and we hear them coming, and obviously this is a big. Let's just talk about this. How did you feel through that whole thing?
When that scream in the it was just so visceral. It was the point that really got it for me was when he screamed right in the face, and it was just like, holy heck! Imagining that close to your face, it's just like, what do you even do? And to see how it really shows how they've overcome the horrors of the environment around them, the years that have gone past, and it's just absolutely horrific.
And seeing like Ellie's reaction to seeing a clicker for the first time, and just how very quickly the smartness that she obviously, her smart little quips just goes, and she's like, oh, I need to trust these people now because I'm fucked. I'm beeped. You know, clever. Oh, it's horrible. And seeing how well like Tess and Joel work together is really cool.
Yeah. And on that point about Ellie as well, like we kind of see that in that moment after, once it all starts to go and they're hiding from the clickers, like that's where Ellie's kind of been mostly giving Joel side eye and talking to Tess. See, like Tess a bit more relatable until that point, and then it's like, oh, Joel can protect me. I need to make sure I'm by him and do this, and follow around.
Yeah.
But that, like, I think that point where they're kind of behind the glass case and he's got his finger and like that moment where the clicker kind of appears around the back. Particularly as that's something I've had happen to me. Where you're like, oh, I didn't realize it was behind me.
Yeah, so our obviously Last of Us Part 2 cosplay film we did, or We Lost, there's a scene in our film that's like exactly like that, where obviously I'm Ellie and then the lovely Sophie is Dina, and we were in this like abandoned, it was like a old shut down factory filming, and we had Hattie, who's like an incredible prosthetic artist who made her clicker, and there's a scene that we filmed where myself as Ellie and Sophie as Dina are like hid behind the wall, and you see the clicker walk past the window, and I just like go to her shush. And even like filming cosplay thing, just knowing like something that creepy is there is really unsettling. So imagining that with like a full film crew, and just I can't imagine like the adrenaline the actors felt, and it must have been like really cool to film. Terrifying but cool.
Yeah. What was the quote from Pedro Pascal where he said, it was all very practical, too practical.
Yeah, too much.
How did you feel about, again, we're kind of used as gamers to like playing it, and you've got like something of a power fantasy there, because even though you've got like limited resources, limited ammo, you generally got a handle on the situation if you've used to playing it, and you're able to kind of move around quite easily, whereas they feel a lot more like people who they've survived and they've dealt with this, but they're also, it's not a situation you ever get used to. It's not a situation you can just run through like a game and like, oh yeah, I've practiced this before, I know what I'm doing, it's fine. It's utterly terrifying, and one wrong move and you're dead, and that sort of thing. And the kind of chaos of the gunshots going wide or not having the impact and everything, like how did that feel? Kind of a lot more real as far as the characters and just a lot more terrifying.
I feel like I don't think they missed a mark, but there were certain parts where there's a bit where Joel's up against like the cabinet and his gun's empty, so he's like emptying out the gun. And he like slips it in his pocket like really quietly, and I was like, throw it the other side of the room, make them go the other side. So I was sort of wondering why that, like they made such a big point of the clickers obviously being based on sound. I was quite surprised they didn't utilize that more with them distracting them.
Yeah. To pick up a random brick and
yeah.
So I was intrigued at why they didn't utilize that more. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, go on, man.
No, right. Sorry, it's their choice of weaponry as well. You think if they would be more the classic pipe or knife or whatever, but
Yeah, crafting
how
a
he
shiv
goes
in the
straight in.
corner.
Yeah. Um, yeah, but how he goes in with the rifle, and you'd think that's going to start calling them more now.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting how
Yeah.
obviously Joel and Tess are really versed in how this world works, but at the same time, as fans of the game watching it, it feels a bit like at times, and I don't know whether this is going to change in the future episodes, and they're going to more heavily rely on things like distractions. It felt a bit like, do this, backseat gaming.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say I don't know whether there was like a like decision in terms of the editing and like the time they had or whatever to do the points about not like throwing in and building other things in, whether that became too big. But the thing that kind of struck to me from a story kind of side of it was, again, calling back to that thing of no matter how many times you deal with it, especially if I think they mentioned last time that it had been like a year since they'd last been outside or something like that. Like that's not that they're trying to get across that's not a situation you can necessarily get used to, and you're always going to kind of be panicking, and if you're panicking, you might not be thinking straight enough to go, oh, if I throw something so it makes a sound over there, you might be just like, okay, I need to be as silent as possible. This sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I think I do like that sort of touch of it, like that they're not just video game protagonists, that they're people who've like facing something which is genuinely horrific, which, one bite and you're a goner essentially. And then speaking of bites, is obviously Ellie gets bit again in that moment, which from what Craig and Neil have said is basically their way of proving that she's immune without having the spores and the underground sequence that they have where she breathes it all in. But the one thing that kind of stood out to me about that was that this is really a nitpick. This is like, it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but she got bit in the exact same place, even though she had her sleeve up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose if you bite through, but that would have torn the sleeve as well.
Yeah, I really wondered. I actually said about a month ago with a few other fans, I was like, Ellie's going to get bitten again, because they needed to. I feel like Ellie's immunity was almost a little bit rushed in the first episode. I feel like it was quite, for people that weren't familiar with the world at all, I feel like that was a very sudden thing and it wasn't as big an impact as it could have been. So obviously in the game, when they go into the spores, that's a really big moment for Joel being like, oh, okay, you are immune. So I was like, they need to show that in another way. So I was like, I bet Ellie's going to get bit. So watching that, I was like, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, it gives the opportunity to like have the in-game healing animation wrap the bandage around her arm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite funny. But I did like how Ellie got bit at the same time that obviously poor old Tess did, even though we didn't know it at the time.
No.
Yeah. I mean, immediately after that, before we see that Tess's got bitten, we see, and before the rooftop scene between Joel and Ellie, we see this moment between Joel and Tess as he's kind of bandaging up her foot, and she gives him a look, and there's a lot, and this comes, I suppose, to what's said in the Capitol building as well, which we can expand on more, but just interested, like, your thoughts on in terms of the relationship developing, there, and how that kind of affected like the dynamic between the two, and the difference between like their outlooks on things. Because she also, so she gives him this look, and there's obviously affection there, but she also chastises him for not being hopeful enough about the second bite, which we know afterwards because she's bitten. She's like, oh God, if she's immune, this is like the only chance that we've got. Like, this shouldn't be what I'm facing. But yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a difference that expands more on the relationship was already there, but it's obviously a difference from the game as far as what we get in that moment in the rooftop scene is that, like, when Joel has the conversation which follows with Ellie, he then sort of does the same thing he does there, where he looks at his watch and he looks all forlorn, but Tess is still all business and she snaps at him to pull it together, whereas he's already kind of starting to unravel and that sort of thing. I mean, how did you guys feel about the way that Joel and Tessa's relationship has kind of played out and panned across these 2 episodes, and like the dynamic that they have?
I think they've really built it up quite quickly, but obviously it feels a lot stronger, I find, than for what it was in the games. So obviously it makes that point at the end of episode 2 a lot more poignant.
I found in the game, to me, it was never explicitly clear that Tess and Joel were in a relationship. I always viewed it more of like a business like thing, like just, friends with benefits in a world that, they work together and they just sort of like, but it never to me came across as romantic. But obviously how Joel treats Tess in the first episode when she gets hurt and he cleans her up and he sort of freaks out a bit that she got hurt. And then seeing obviously how he treats her in the second episode, it was really nice to get that bit more of a development between Tess and Joel to show he still does have that, as much as obviously he hides it away, he does still have that ability to love and that ability to open up to someone in his own way. So it was a hard watch, like knowing that Tess doesn't have a happy ending. Like, it was hard to see that character development, and I'm really hoping we get more Tess in the future. I hope we get a few more, flashbacks with Joel, but we'll see.
Yeah, and jumping around a little bit, we kind of get a bit more of this with the once she's revealed she's bitten and once we know the infected are on their way, which we will talk about in more depth in a moment, but just kind of to feed into that point, where she's asking Joel to take Ellie to Bill and Frank's, and she says that line of like, I never asked you to feel how I feel, like that sort of moment of like, does that kind of feed into that point you were saying about like the way the relationship ended? It like that's kind of bittersweet thing to it.
Yeah, I feel like Tess was definitely probably more romantic than Joel. Like, romance obviously would have a very different look and feel in the apocalypse, but I feel like Tess probably wanted more emotionally from Joel and just never quite got that. So it's really, it's hard. That line was a really poignant one, I found, that, I never asked you to feel how I felt, because she obviously wanted more.
Yeah. And I think it's worth mentioning. I don't know if you have seen about this, because again, coming back to the showrunners and what they've mentioned, like, because there's so much more to this that they've like not included as well, because they mentioned that they'd written a scene like to have a flashback with Tess to mention that she had a husband and a child before the outbreak, and had to kill her husband and couldn't bring herself to kill the child and locked them away in the cupboard, and this sort of thing. We never get to see that, so we never kind of go. But that, I think, it adds a different dynamic as well. I mean, particularly coming back to this point about Tess hoping versus Joel's kind of relentless, kind of even after the second bite is still not really wanting to believe in anything, like the way that the loss that they faced has affected them in like different ways, and how that shaped the way each of them view their own relationship as well.
Yeah. And obviously Joel, it's very obvious Joel doesn't want to open up to anyone, because last time that happened, we all know how that ended.
Yeah.
So I do hope we see more of Tess. I think it's quite an interesting little thing that got pointed out to me that I think Tess is credited for 5 episodes on IMDb. So that makes me hope that we get more Tess, but that's also just me being a Tess fangirl, so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't see, especially with the more episode-driven storytelling, like I can't see them just completely dropping Tess at this point. And I mean, again, coming back to the game, like she's has that impact which lasts, but she's never mentioned from memory after Billstown. I think Bill is the last person to mention her, and then the rest of the game, she's completely out of it. So, but I imagine with the pace in this and with what we've seen about them bringing more, there will be more callbacks to it, not just in flashbacks, but presumably in terms of how her memory and what she wanted affects, obviously, decisions that may be taken later on, which may or may not influence whether that happens. To be as cryptic as humanly possible. So, yeah. So, any more thoughts on kind of that Joel and Tess interaction before we move forward to the rooftop scene? No.
Nothing more.
Okay.
No.
So yeah, I mean the rooftop scene's pretty much beat for beat as it was in the game before they jumped down, and go towards the Capitol building, which is where things take a very different turn from the way they did in the game. So, the first most obvious changes is the Fireflies have not been killed by Fedra; they've been killed by infected, and there's Cordyceps, there's fungal growth everywhere. And this is where we start to see how this mycelium network actually works once they kind of go into there. So yeah, like we get this a bit more tense outside when they're like looking into the truck and they can't see anyone, and they go inside the building because there's a trail of blood steps, which kind of leads up to it a bit more tensely than kind of just wandering into the building. And then we see Tess frantically looking for any clue again, as we discussed, because she's still desperately clinging on to the hope that even if she's done for, she can do something to like make it right. So before we get on to what happens next, I don't know if there's anything you want to kind of talk about in terms of how the performances delivered in any of that section, or any feelings about that preamble before the big finale.
Yeah. No, I think there's a bit of foreshadowing with Tess because of obviously how frantic she was about getting in. Considering how much growth there is and everything that's going on, you wouldn't really, if you were knowing you're going to live a bit longer than Tess was going to, you wouldn't rush in and run around because you don't know what you're going to trigger, you don't know what you're going to start off. But obviously Tess knows, I'm about to go, I need to quickly try and do something before. So yeah, no, I thought that was really cool.
It's a really interesting shift of dynamic, isn't it? Because beforehand it's been Joel that's almost been quite frantic and very much, we need to go back, this isn't going to work, we need to go back, and Tess has been the voice of reason and been like, we need to see this through. So suddenly seeing that shift where Joel's like, they're not here, this isn't going to work, but in a calm way, and seeing Tess like freaking out.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have watched that scene as someone that doesn't know the story, because I feel like it would have been really, I don't know if I would have picked up on the fact of, what's happened to her.
Yeah, until that moment when you see the bite and then the kind of the flinching and the reaction from Joel and everything that happens there. So yeah, I mean, I think that leaves us to dive into the big scene. One of the Fireflies is there, just you step on the hand, and then it kind of triggers everything a mile away, and they all start to rise. And we also see a lot more of that as well, and not just kind of the runners, but like I don't think they're. I'm kind of trying to categorize them by the game enemies, but like I don't think they're necessarily fit as neatly into those categories anymore. But because there's some that have got like the stalks growing out the head and everything else in that pre-clicker phase, but then they're all kind of coming towards the state house, and then S has got to give them that distraction to escape. And obviously, what happens is the kind of the petrol or gas goes everywhere, and then the lights are seen, and that one infected hones in on her, and like we see the tendrils and the kiss. So, yeah. Thoughts on how this happened and what happened and the choices made?
Ugh. First and foremost, I hate the tendrils. They freak me out so much. I have a fun fact about me. I have a really weird thing. So my this is a bit off track. My birthday is Outbreak Day, by the way. My birthday is the 26th of September. Which is a weird little Last of Us fact. And another fun Last of Us kind of fact is the fact I have a really, really strong phobia of mold. So the show's really lent into obviously the mold thing. So like the bit where obviously the tendrils are triggered, and you see the tendrils go up into the like under the fingernails of the infected. Oh my god! I was like, this is horrific. This is the worst thing I've ever seen. But I found it really interesting that they changed it from like Fedra to the infected coming in. That was a really interesting change.
Yeah. So a positive change, did it done well or not so much, or a bit of a mix?
I think we needed, obviously we had the clicker scene, but I think we needed a big infected scene to get new viewers more invested and to see the threat. Because I feel like obviously the clickers are a threat in themselves, but we hadn't necessarily seen that hive mind and established just how much of a unit they are. So I think that was a cool change, and it made it more. I think it was a good change. Whether or not the kiss thing was something that I necessarily enjoyed, but
yeah, I mean, especially with your mold fear, that probably ramped it up to like 11 or.
It's the opening scene where obviously the doctor opens up the leg of the original infected person. It's just like a sheet of mold under it. I was like, nope, I'm out.
What about you, Will? Your thoughts on the change, like, well, on the whole thing in general there and how it was done?
Yeah. No, I think for how they've shown it, I think it fits a lot better with the narrative that they're going forward with. It fits in better with the world. And I just absolutely hated it when obviously they started awakening. You see one pair of feet go, and then there's another pair, and then all of a sudden it's like a huge stampede, and you're like, "Oh my god, this is how are they going to get out of this?" But yeah,
I mean, I in general terms, like I say, I'm also of the view that having the infected there, I can see the rationale for it, and I think it worked really well overall. I think seeing that moment was really tense and really frightening, and having the kind of rush, I like that. There were a few bits where, like, well, I'll talk about the kiss in a second, but I was also kind of that moment with the lighter and flicking the lighter, and it not coming on, kind of felt like, why are you doing that when there are grenades on the floor?
Yeah.
Why do you not just pick up a grenade and pull the pin out? That but I mean, I guess that they said they wanted to show the tendrils in action and how, like, once you're infected, you become part of the network and they pull you in and all that sort of stuff. Which, again, I kind of get, I do get that. And in the whole scene and in the moment, it all just kind of worked, and then everything blew up, and it was like, whoa, that was one hell of a scene. But yeah, at the same time, they're kind of romanticizing Tessa'S death in that way, and having it like be like the first like person to die, like the fact that she's a woman, and it's like a romanticized this kiss of death and that sort of thing, because that felt weird, like, and not just in a like it's scary and I wouldn't want this to happen to me kind of way, although that's also true. But it just, I feel like they could have done everything else and maybe shown the kiss thing somewhere else with a different character and not done it in the way that they did, because that just felt totally off. I think that was probably, like I say, that one point was the only thing that I kind of had any kind of big issue with in the episode. Like everything else was like absolutely fantastic, but that one point just kind of was like, I don't know how to feel about that.
I did come away with like very conflicted feelings about it, because on the one hand I was like, this is very smart in the way that obviously that's just how the tendrils connect and spread, and it makes me wonder if obviously like it goes into her, if it like splits, like if that's how it spreads, if it splits off. And I've seen a lot of people obviously theorizing that Tess was mostly sort of, going at that point, but obviously she had those feelings for Joel, and therefore like it was a romantic gesture that she never got with Joel. So instead of getting the kiss of love, she got the kiss of death, like you said. But it did feel, I don't know, it's a really interesting like conversation point, because I've seen a lot of people that aren't happy with it, and I've seen a lot of people that are like, oh, this was really haunting. To me, I think I would have really liked to have seen her like fall to the floor and like the Cordyceps start coming up and taking her in that way. But I don't know. I have mixed feelings on it, and I don't quite know how to feel.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. No.
Sorry, go on, Will.
Yeah, no, I think it, as you were saying before, like I think she was obviously going with the infection, and part of the Cordyceps is that it's their changing to survive, make the host survive. So I know Tess was saying like, I want to blow myself up, but it's basically saying no, you've got to stop, and that's why I think she froze, was because she wanted to do something, but obviously they were wanting to connect with her and bring her into the pack. So I thought it quite suited quite well. I think I quite enjoyed the scene. Obviously, a big change, because obviously in the game you don't really see any of that. You see her just as Joel and Ellie walk away, just see a slight flicker of a stern face that she has. But just before the scene goes, she sort of face droops and she realizes, I'm about to go. So I absolutely loved how we got so much more out of that, and showing that Tess is such a badass in the game, and it's showing that more emotional, as we were talking about before, the more emotional human side of her, and building that character on from what we know from the game. So yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah,
I think I agree, but in a way that I feel like we missed out on Tess getting like a big ending of her being defiant and being strong, because that's her character. We missed out on her having the final say in an awful situation, I feel like. But if we see more in the future of like that's how the Cordyceps really spreads, of if someone gets infected, then the other infected will like pull to them and just like sort of infect them more, I think that'll make that scene feel more justified.
yeah. If it becomes over time less gendered, specifically, I think as well.
Yeah.
But I mean,
yeah, 'cause the first episode, the granny's like on the neck, isn't she? It's not in the mouth or anything. It's just neck.
Yeah, and then sort of just see it kind of drooping out as she looks up towards Sarah. Yeah, I mean, mixed feelings about the kiss moment specifically aside. I think absolute props to Anatov, and I think just going back to your point, Will, about the emotion that Tess showed. I think that was absolutely superbly done, as far as like this character that you do feel for, and that moment has an impact, and a huge impact. And it wouldn't, obviously, if she hadn't delivered that performance and everything else. So I think that's kind of the big takeaway moment from there. But then we also get very briefly before everything ends, Joel and Ellie watch everything blow up and Tess is gone, and like Joel walks away, and we see that like moment where they each glance at each other, and we don't really know how they feel about each other at that point because they've just kind of seen Tess die, they've seen this horrible thing, and like they've kind of been thrust together by circumstance now, and it's just each other, but they're not necessarily very happy about it. So how that'll feed into the dynamics going into Bill's Town in the next episode will be very interesting to see, I think.
Yeah, I loved that shift from Pedro, obviously, when Tess revealed that she was infected and they had that whole exchange, and the way that Pedro portrayed Joel just grabbing Ellie and walking out without a goodbye, without anything. I felt that was really, really like I was really impressed by that. That was a really cool, like not cool, but you know, a really poignant take on how Joel deals with grief now, because I think he expressed all of his sadness with Sarah. You know, I feel like he tries just not to react to anything. So the way he just grabs Ellie and just drags her out, it was really impactful.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and then that brings us to the end of the episode, and that's kind of everything we've been through. So before we kind of talk about a few other things in terms of like some news that we know about the show coming up and kind of what we hope for the next episode, any more kind of final thoughts on the episode that's been? Any additional points that we haven't had a chance to touch on?
I think so.
No, I'm just thinking of how it's going to impact Joel, Tess's death in the future, where he's going to snap and what he's going to do. See if it's
It will be interesting to see, because like I say, I do think they will call back to it more than they did in the game, or more explicitly at least. So
Yeah.
So I mean, with that, just before we kind of talk about what we want to see next, so that episode 2, what saw, like, I think we're seeing a lot in terms of the popularity of the show and how much of an impact it's making, that like viewership jumped up by 22% compared to the first episode, which was already, I think, the second largest opening other than House of the Dragon for HBO.
4.7 million.
Yeah, so
Crazy.
it's clearly like gaining momentum at this point. It being a talking point, it also means that the games have seen a huge sales boost. So like the sales of the remaster for the PlayStation 4 have jumped up by 322%. Sales of Part 1 remake on PS5 have jumped up by 238%. So people are seeing this and going, this is interesting. I want to play the games, and they're picking up the games and jumping into that world as well, which, again, as a fan of a thing, you always want more people to like share your special interests and go join in. So, you know, if you're one of the people who's picking up the games for the first time, then welcome to the pack. Welcome to the horde.
The Heartbreak City.
The other things that we know that we've heard this week, there are three things mainly. So one is that Neil Druckmann has talked about how when we're going to see story of Ellie's mother Anna in this, because she's played by Ashley Johnson. That was actually written originally as a DLC for the first game, which was then scrapped. So the story's going to be now in the show, but that was something that we, you know, in a different world, we might have had an extra DLC besides Left Behind to play, which, depending on how the story goes, and we won't necessarily be able to judge how gameplay fits into it, but it's kind of like, that would have been cool. And also, Naughty Dog should just make more Last of Us DLC for both games.
Yeah.
And they've also mentioned that spores aren't completely off the table. We may see them in season 2. They may come into it more, because I think since the reaction to a lot of stuff that Craig Mason's put out, like he's had further interviews and trying to clarify things where people have taken it one way when it's meant another thing. So that's not completely off the table, and I think, kind of coming back to your point, Abby, if they bring it back and like bring it in a way where it becomes more of a threat and people don't know how to deal with it because they're not used to carrying gas masks around, that'll potentially be interesting to see.
Mm.
And the other one, which is a rumor at this point, but I did see it, and it seemed to like a lot of people kind of picked up on it, was that The Last of Us has not only been greenlit already for season 2, but they're also already in holding for going up to season 4. So again, this is all rumors, so take it with a pinch of salt. But
Yeah.
I mean, that's an interesting thing. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on the idea of 4 seasons already being potentially in the pipeline.
No, you can tell Neil's put so much into the story and how much he must have cut out from the games that he's now further exploring in the TV show. So, yeah, if he's got all this extra stuff, yeah, show it us. I'm very happy.
I have mixed feelings about 4 seasons because, again, a series like Chernobyl worked so well because it was one and done, and it told such a poignant story in one thing without feeling like it had to stretch. But yeah, much like you guys, as a Last of Us fan, if there is more content that was originally intended to be in the game and in the original stories, if we get to see that more, that would be really cool. I'm just intrigued at how closely they then follow into like The Last of Us Part 2 and whether or not they use the TV series now to set up for the next game. That'll be quite an interesting thing if they do that.
Yeah, because Part 2 is about double the length of Part 1. And if Part 1's one season, then theoretically they could split Part 2 into 2 seasons. It wouldn't be split in the same way the Part 2 split, obviously, with that perspective shift and everything else. But that could potentially work. But at the same time, I'm also like, anything that goes beyond that point, I don't want to see it until I've had the chance to play it.
Yeah, I agree.
Bring out Part 3 before we bring out Part 3, the show. If anyone from Naughty Dog is listening, don't do that.
No, I agree.
Yeah, so that's everything that's kind of been going around. I mean, there's been more like little tiny, like there's probably, I think, every little last detail of the show has been picked up and poured over and discussed in interviews. But in terms of things that we've not already talked about ourselves, those are the big things there. So to kind of round things up, let's talk about episode 3 then. From the previews, we know that we are going to Bill and Frank's town. And again, without spoiling anything for people who are only watching the show, the deviation in the terms of it that it's Bill and Frank's town rather than Bill's town is something which means we'll get to see a lot more of the characterization and background there. But what are we most hoping for out of next episode in terms of anything? I suppose, yeah, we'll put a spoiler on in this section. We'll probably have game spoilers if you've not played the game before, so we can talk freely then if you want to suggest what you'd like to see.
I don't mind talking. Yeah, I think, again, when you're playing a video game, you're going, like we said, you're going from A to B and you have character dialogue along the way. So you can't really do that in a TV show because that's going to get boring really quickly. They need to show like more of the characters as people. So Bill is such a highlight in the games. Like, he's such a strong character. So getting to see more of him and how he came to be, the person he is that we see in the game, regarding his relationship with Frank and stuff. I think I'm so excited. I'm so excited to see what Neil envisioned for Frank.
Will, how about yourself?
Yeah. No, I think it's more of the same point, really. Like, seeing the characters that we know from the game and then seeing what more we get from the characters, if you know what I mean, like extended on their human side and see what makes them tick more. I think that's what, I'll be most excited for.
Yeah, and I said in the last episode that one of the things that I was looking forward to for the series as a whole was like seeing a lot more of Bill's character in terms of his relationship with Frank as well. Like that's something Because I've tried to avoid watching reviews, but it's hard to miss that like most reviews have like picked out episode 3 as a particular standout and all this sort of stuff. So there's a lot of expectation there, but also, again, kind of drawing back from the games and also drawing back from what we've seen in the trailers about the bloater reveal. I'm really hoping it's still in Billstown. I'm really hoping we get to see that moment, like where we finally see a bloater and stuff, is next episode, because I think all the sort of romantic and tragic backstories and whatever we see in, whether it's flashbacks or whether it's in the present and all that sort of stuff, I think that would be a perfect framing for then end it all with this massive horrifying creature and just finally revealing that, because that's my big hope there, I suppose, is give us romance and a bloater.
Yeah, I'm intrigued because we're okay to sort of not spoil the game, but talk about Bill and Frank in the game.
Yeah.
Because obviously in the game we don't know exactly what happened, but we know that Frank and Bill had like a big falling out, and then Bill thought Frank left the town, but that wasn't necessarily the case. So I'm really interested to see if they follow that same storyline, if they have a big falling out, or if something changes in how Bill and Frank end up not being necessarily together when Joel and Ellie find them, like go to Bill's town. Because I feel like it's still, my prediction is that a lot of the episode is going to be a flashback to how Bill and Frank met and who Bill and Frank are. And then by the time Joel and Ellie get there, Frank is no longer around in one way or another. But that's just my prediction for the episode. So, because I feel like we need to see a bit more of like different characters and human interactions to see just how different people are existing and surviving in this world.
Yeah, absolutely, and it'll be interesting to see. I kind of, I think, share that view that most of it'll be flashback. I'm hoping we still get like quite a lot in the present. I hope we get like Bill's interactions with Ellie in particular. I think that was always a particular highlight. But yeah, because I'm pretty sure, like from what they've shown, it's almost confirmed that there will be quite a significant chunk of flashback. So how that's divided up, I think, will be very interesting to see.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's. But we can obviously talk about that in a lot more depth in a week's time. Eagerly awaiting the next one.
My Mondays have got a lot more exciting.
Yeah, I also find, I don't know if you guys have found this as well. Like, basically from go to bed on Sunday night, and as soon as you wake up, you basically have to avoid social media until you get a chance to get home and watch it, because it's like everything. Like, you go on Twitter and immediately it's like someone talking about, oh, this thing. Okay, I'll leave that. I'll come back to.
Yeah.
Which I suppose one day they'll decide, okay, well, if America's getting it at 9 p.m. on a Sunday, then the UK can get it at their 9 p.m. on a Sunday. What does it hurt? What does it matter?
Yeah.
We always get because we always get stiffed with stuff like that. It's like, no, well, you have to watch it 2 a.m. It's like, oh, come on.
Yeah.
No, I'm not staying up till. I love you, naughty dog, but I'm not staying up till 2 a.m.
Aye. Oh, right. So, that's everything for this week. Before we go, for my guests, if there's anything you want to plug in particular in terms of where people should follow you and find you, or any interesting projects coming up, then now is the time to do it. So, Will, do you want to go first?
Yeah, you can find me on pretty much any other social media under Resident Evil Central. We've got a couple of projects lined up with Game Flavor. I'm hooking up with another member of the Resident Evil community on Twitter. We've got an interesting project in line with the drink, so it pairs up with it quite well. But yeah, that's what we've got coming up.
Nice. Abby?
I'm pretty much Opalink cosplay on everything. I'm a very avid video game cosplayer, and as mentioned at the start of the episode, I'm the official Atreus cosplayer for God of War Ragnarok. I have an in-depth series on my YouTube documenting how I made my Atreus cosplay, and I'll soon have a vlog going up about my visit over to the States and visiting Santa Monica Studio. And if you like The Last of Us, as prior mentioned, I am part of a cosplay group called Spores Productions, where we make fan films based on game content and media, and we did a 26-minute Last of Us Part 2 fan film that is free to watch on YouTube called All We Lost, so you can check that out. And we have some other really exciting gaming projects planned up, which we'll be announcing on our Patreon very soon.
And thank you very much. And check out the links in the description and show them some love and support if you can. And thank you once again for coming along. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about all things The Last of Us. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, then make sure you give it a like and consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content, including future episodes of this podcast, other videos on The Last of Us, Resident Evil, and horror gaming, and my live streams where I'm doing whole game permadeath runs on The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2 until I can eventually beat both games back to back without dying.
You're insane.
Thank you.
Yeah.
check out the links in the description for my Patreon to join my Patreon for as little as £1 a month, or donate to my GoFundMe and get your name in the credits of my videos, like those at the end of this video, who I want to thank again for supporting me and my content. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.
Thank you.